Good morning, everyone. I'm Jordan Sanchez, and this is On Climate Denial. Denial is the first stage of grief, but what are you grieving? Maybe the fact that our clean air is leaving, our lungs constantly receiving the gray ourselves, slowly receding into the black. Our blue waters we pretended to love, suffocated with plastic we disposed of, red turns to dove who flies away, with no coming back. Back into time when I still saw, seeing green and gold and green and blue. Seeing is believing, but I can only see one place at one time. Hurricanes in Houston, freezing people in Chicago, Bangladesh underwater, but I can only see one place at one time. The time is now, but when is now really? 3 months ago, 2 weeks ahead, last year, yesterday. It was yesterday when I was anxiously waiting for a phone call from Grandma Vicky down in San Juan. It was yesterday when I saw the beautiful island suffocated by the heavy gray fog. It was yesterday. The New York City skyline is flooded. Not with water this time, but empty promises that float to the top, stealing the air, and all you can do is sit and stare at the world around you. She is crying out to you in the form of ashes and smoke, smoke and ashes. Ashes and hope are all we have left, and all there is left to do is right. Searching for direction, all we can look to is each other. Look up and what do you see? What do you hear? If it is a colorless world you do not fear, you aren't thinking hard enough, thinking far enough. Look inside yourself and ask if you're doing enough. If you acknowledge the climate crisis, you'll see that the climate price is too much for us to bear. And I'm not talking polar bears. All it takes is for you to care. Not about the birds, the bees, or Florida's orange trees, but about people. Your friends, family, community, creating the change we need to see when you stop and breathe. All you can think is that this problem is so much bigger than me. But no one's asking you to plant 1 billion trees or develop renewable energies, but we all have to contribute to this international society. You see, big problems are made up of little ones, and solutions are the same way. Acceptance is the last stage of grief, but this state is impossible to claim. The world will never be the same. Call the crisis by its name, climate denial. All it takes to break those chains is mindful living and small steps that still make a difference. Thank you.
Jordan, that was beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us today. Jordan is an 18-year-old writer who is passionate about advocating for the world. The piece she just shared on climate denial, she shared in June of 2019 at the Apollo Theater. We are privileged to hear your words and to really open us up this morning with a conversation about what climate means, the future flow, the people, the politics, and the policies of rising tides. I am absolutely honored to join you all today on behalf of the Raven Group, and this is one of the many series that we're putting together for the Raven Respite as a complement to the Democratic National Convention. Thank you for tuning in. We're going to have a really powerful conversation today, and I'm going to start pulling in our panelists, Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar, Nate Mook, and Mustafa Santiago Ali will all be sharing their expertise and their experiences today. So first of all, I just want to thank you all for joining us. And I would love for Nate, if you don't mind, to start us off. And you have a real sort of perspective around food insecurity, supply chain issues during natural disasters. And more specifically, solutions, what private companies can do during that time. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brandy. And thank you to the Raven Group for having us here today for this important conversation. World Central Kitchen, we're a nonprofit organization founded by a chef named Jose Andres back in 2010 after the devastating earthquake in Haiti, looking at how food can play a role in some of the big challenges that our world faces right now, especially as it relates to our changing climate. We've been on the front lines of climate change through the lens of climate disasters. We've now served well over 40 million meals to those impacted over the last 3 years. And, you know, we've seen, all of us have seen, I think, the changes to our planet, the accelerating changes to our planet. What used to be a once in a decade occurrence to have a Category 5 hurricane now is a yearly occurrence, sometimes multiple times per year. We've seen firsthand the devastation that these climate disasters can have on places like the Bahamas, Puerto Rico, and other communities around the world that really do not have the ability to respond. So what do we do about it? I think that's one of the questions that really faces us right now. And I think as we look at this problem, one of the things that has become clear is that we can't wait for solutions from the outside. We can't wait for governments to come in, to swoop in and save the day. Anybody watching the news unfold after Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico saw this firsthand. We need to look for new ideas, new solutions that can really empower the local communities and those that are most impacted. The reality is that the impacts of these types of climate disasters really affect those marginalized communities that are otherwise most vulnerable in the first place, right? These are the communities that are facing food insecurity on a day-to-day basis. And yet oftentimes it can be ignored until a crisis happens and it shoots to the forefront. And so I think as we look at this problem, we really have to step back and start looking at where those vulnerable, marginalized communities exist in the first place and how we can start to tackle some of those underlying issues. And this is really what World Central Kitchen has been focusing on in both our immediate emergency response and also to building resilience for the long term. With our work, we've coming at it from a bit of a different perspective, from the perspective of the food industry, from restaurants and chefs and the culinary sectors. How do we bring together, the best of the private sector, the best of the public sector, and merge those two things together to be able to respond quickly and efficiently. So a quick example of this in Puerto Rico. Instead of bringing a bunch of bread in from Miami, putting it on a ship, trying to ship it down, so people in the residents impacted in Puerto Rico who lost power, communications, water, so that bread could then be distributed, why not activate the local existing bakeries on the island, get them fuels for their generators, get those bakeries up and running, get those businesses working. It's going to be faster. It's going to be much more efficient to distribute. And in the end, you're then uplifting those businesses that are impacted in the first place. So this is what we really do. We don't sort of parachute in from the outside and say, we've got these answers. We say, let's work alongside the local communities. Let's bring our expertise, experience, resources to the table, and then let those communities really support themselves, right? It's a view of empowerment versus saving. And I think this is a new lens that we need to really look at this problem. And the last thing I'll mention is that we have to look at how we can start to build resilience for the long term. It's not enough to go in and respond to these types of climate crises, right? It's about how do we start to fix those underlying systems that are broken in the first place that lead to the food insecurity. In Puerto Rico, we've now we're still there, coming on 3 years after Hurricane Maria. We've now invested as a nonprofit. We're not trying to make any money, but I think it's a better term than sort of granting or because it's really about believing in it. It's much more than just financial support. But we've invested in and partnered with about 200 local food businesses on the island. These are local farmers, fisheries, food businesses that are selling products. We've set up farmers markets, and we've worked on the supply chain. Before Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, the island was importing over 85% of its food. This just isn't sustainable in a world where we have these types of climate impacts. We need populations to be able to support themselves from the beginning. So I think this is going to be so critical as we look to the future, and it's what World Central Kitchen is really focused on as we do our work.
That's fantastic. I mean, you've lifted up so many concepts. Thank you for sharing in terms of really, number one, the pace of these natural disasters and being able to respond in shorter order, not relying on the older infrastructure and systems that were in place to be able to support that. But also just there's no Superman coming to save anyone, right? Like I think there's some learning that's happening in real time from what you've outlined. And it's important to make sure that people don't feel like you're facilitating a handout when all they're asking for is some support in a moment of need, right? And so, Dr. Mustafa, I want to just shift to you for a moment, if we can, to talk about some of the equity dynamics that I think Nate is articulating they're trying to be sensitive to in this time.
Yeah, if we're going to have a conversation about climate change, about the climate emergency that we find ourselves in, then we really need to make sure that we are understanding the fullness of the history of our country, and how systemic racism has played a role in the creation of the dumping grounds, of the sacrifice zones where we often find our most vulnerable communities, communities of lower wealth communities, and of course, Indigenous brothers and sisters. And if we go back and look at that history, then we understand, how Indigenous brothers and sisters were, in many instances, tried to be removed from their land, tried to strip culture away from them, and often been placed in very dangerous areas beyond some of their natural spaces that they had been protecting for millennia. And then, of course, when we look at African slaves who were brought to this country, they were brought here around worker justice issues, if you really understand it, because they had an expertise, but people didn't want to pay them for that expertise. So they put them in bondage. They also placed them on plantations in very dangerous situations, working for 14 or 16 hours a day in extreme heat or extreme cold, which, of course, now we understand the dynamics of how that plays out on the human body. And if we also understand how culture was stripped away from Africans who were brought to this country, then we understand the power dynamic that was being put in place so that structurally you could dehumanize folks. And through that dehumanization, you could then manipulate both the public's understanding of what is going on and the resources that never came to those communities. So as we travel through history, from the time of slavery to Jim Crowism, we start to see how public policies were put in place. So Black folks never got their 40 acres and a mule, which would help to put them in a position of being able to build wealth, to strengthen their communities. But instead, they got public policies that actually put them in very dangerous situations. And as we begin to move through time, through the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and 60s, we begin to see how redlining and restrictive covenants were put in place to push people into certain areas. We see it in our housing policy. We see it in transportation policy, in banking policy, and of course, in the environmental policy as well. And what we have then are these sacrifice zones. This is where people place everything that nobody else wants: coal-fired power plants, incinerators, waste transfer stations, landfills, low income and dilapidated housing, which also plays a role in our climate work. And what you'll find is that in these communities, places like Port Arthur, Texas, places like Princeville, North Carolina, founded by freed slaves, Union Hill, Virginia, founded by freed slaves, and a number of other areas, the 48217 in Detroit, you will find the fossil fuel infrastructure lives in these locations. And there, because of the exposures, and we know over 100,000 people die prematurely each year from air pollution, and disproportionately, it is African-American and Latinx brothers and sisters who are the ones who are getting sick and the ones who are losing their lives. What we find in those situations is, in this COVID-19 moment, that because of the pre-existing medical conditions from those exposures, and the exposures have been happening throughout time, but we're dealing with this particular moment now, that it makes them more vulnerable to COVID-19, because we have cancer clusters in these communities because of the toxic loading that happens in these communities. We have liver and kidney diseases. We have lung diseases, which of course plays directly into COVID-19. And we have that fossil fuel infrastructure that brothers and sisters have been fighting against. Our pipelines. We have 2.4 million miles of pipeline in our country that carries these people would say energy sources, but I say toxic pollution when it's not done properly. And what we find is that 2.4 million miles of pipeline that brothers and sisters at Standing Rock and many of the other pipeline fights that have been going on, you could literally go to the moon and back, to the moon and back, and on your way to the moon again. But yet we still have folks who continue to want to create more. And when we create more, that means it is going to be utilized and it's going to be placed in our communities. And I'll just also say, as a part of this conversation, our transportation routes have also been utilized to move wealth into certain communities and extract wealth from other communities and dump off pollution. So as we go through our public policies, we have the opportunity in this moment to make real change happen. Because if we don't, as was shared before, we will have more instances like Hurricane Maria. We will have more Hurricane Katrina, and those pictures, those iconic pictures that I hope are burned into the memory of every person in our country and beyond. In the Superdome, when you see thousands and thousands of Black and brown people and lower wealth white communities standing in that situation, now in this COVID-19 moment, there's no possibility that we could have people dealing with that situation and not getting infected from COVID-19. Systemic racism is woven into our country, and it's time for us to exorcise that sin that our country has been built on.
My goodness, if you all are just joining us, go get your coffee. We are fired up and ready to go today. We really have 3 phenomenal speakers. Thank you for that, Dr. Mustafa Ali. I feel like there are so many things that I want to make sure I pull out before we introduce Chief Sherelle. You know, the sacrifice zones, just that framing alone, I think is so poignant, because you really are speaking to neglect. And there's a lack of investment of Black and brown Americans that have not been validated. And to your points earlier, Nate, you know, when it comes to these critical moments and being able to reach those demographics, it's a challenge, and you can't look to the traditional infrastructures to be able to do that on a dime and when people need it the most. And you know, Mustafa, I think you also just beautifully created a landscape picture of sort of the importance from a medical perspective. We may not use the frame and terminology around humidity and climate change, for example. Pregnancy disproportionately impacting Black women, so that procreation, the most natural thing, becomes a real barrier. There were 52 studies that came out recently just affirming that correlation. And then just being able to make sure that you're putting Black and brown folks in leadership positions, all the way from, you know, on the ground level within these organizations like yourself, Mustafa, and also to the Supreme Court, right? To be able to fully get a lens of what it is that we're evaluating as a country, so that we can be ready to respond to the call to action, which is happening now. I want to pull in Chief Sherelle to this conversation. I think, you know, Mustafa talked earlier about the importance of our Indigenous brothers and sisters and how they're responding during this moment, and the heritage around our natural resources. So I would love for you to share with us a bit of your perspective. I know that we're having some technical challenges keeping you in the call. Okay, so we're just going to pivot. One of the things that I was hoping we could talk a little bit more about, Nate, was what are the lessons learned in terms of dealing with the government when you have to navigate these immediate crisis management issues when there's a natural disaster and you have resources that you have to deploy? How do you manage that partnership?
It's a great question, and it's one that I think is always evolving. You know, I think as Dr. Mustafa is so I think poignantly articulated. You know, as we look at these sort of sacrifice areas and the lack of response, we're seeing this regularly. Even now with the COVID-19 crisis, looking at a place like Navajo Nation, you know, this is a community that had higher COVID rates and death rates per capita than New York City. And yet federal funding was held up to support these communities. And as you go and as you meet with the families there. We've had a team working with the local Dene people in Navajo Nation for months now. What you realize is that, you know, this is not a sort of singular issue that just came up, right? Everything is all so interconnected to that history that Dr. Mustafa has mentioned. You know, looking at Navajo Nation, for example, this is a place that has you know, been marginalized and neglected and is extraordinarily food insecure, and many families don't even have access to clean water. Which is just shocking. Access to fresh foods, being able to grow food on their land remains a major challenge. And so it's not just that COVID hit Navajo Nation very hard. What you saw is that the reason it hit hard is because these families, intergenerational families living together, had to go and get food. You know, they had to travel. They had to go to the Walmarts and the, you know, the places, the only places that they can access food that are not nearby. They have to go out. They have to interact with the public. They, you know, and then they bring all of that back into their local families and their local communities, which starts to build that community spread. So I think as you look at the federal government's response, I think what we're learning is that, of course, the scale and the power and the resources that the federal government has are unparalleled, right? The nonprofit sector, the private sector cannot do what the government can do at scale. But we also can't wait for the government to come in with the answers. And so I think what needs to happen is there needs to be solutions that can create models these solutions can move quickly, they can get up and running. And then hopefully, and ideally, something that the federal government can plug into. And so I think all of the best solutions are going to often come from those innovators, those entrepreneurs, those that can move fast, that don't have that red tape and the restrictions that maybe traditional governments might have. And we're seeing this now, you know, on the ground in this current disaster that we're facing with COVID, both with our work getting food to families in Navajo Nation, organizations like CORE that are doing mass testing on the ground with Johns Hopkins, creating testing models, creating isolation wards. All of this is done separate from the government. But if the governments can come in and support that and expand it and scale it, I think that's where the magic happens. And so it's an important piece. I think you have to educate, you have to show those models that can work, and that's going to be the way forward.
I appreciate that context. It is a partnership, and you know, there are reasons to keep that relationship strong and healthy, as I'm sure you know best. Thank you for that. I want to, while we have Chief Sherrill, and I appreciate that, you know, we're all doing our best in a virtual context, but I would love for you to share with us. And I also just want to remind our viewers, please send your questions, your comments. We welcome that towards the end of the show. But Chief Sherrill.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning. And Chief Sherrill, if you could just share with us a little bit about your experience in Louisiana, we would love to get your perspective on climate implications there.
Thank you. So I am Chief Sherrill Parfait Dordor of the Grand Cayuga Band of Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw. And I've been active chief now for 11 years. And I have to say that, you know, climate justice has been one of my biggest issues that I've been dealing with as a leader for the past 11 years. You know, so here in our communities, we are on the front lines of climate change. You know, we are right on the coast. You know, the Gulf of Mexico is right at our back door. You know, and it's beautiful, but we have to deal with random flooding events. You know, we have to deal with forced migration, relocation, food shortages. We can no longer have community gardens. We can't keep small livestock. You know, it's just tons and tons of different issues that we've been having to deal with, So we get all of the issues such as sinkage, saltwater intrusion, coastal erosion, and all of that is just thrown into like hyperdrive, with climate change and pollution and all of these man-made um, man-made ailments that we look at today. It all stems from greed, systemic racism. It all goes together, right? My people have been dealing with this and adapting for so many centuries now. I think that we've just become an adapting people.
The frame of an adapting people, and Dr. Mustafa used the frame of a sacrifice zone. I think we are clearly witnessing what Nate's organization is able to do just to feed people on the ground when the federal government has challenges. What are your biggest concerns or fears for the next 1 to 3 years? Because one of the things in preparing for today became clear based on your experience is the pace is really hard to maintain. So as you lead, between now and 3 years from now, what keeps you up at night? Share with us some of those examples on the ground.
Our future generations keep me up at night. It's highly concerning, that we see so much destruction in the world today, especially in, communities of color, right? Food shortages is a very, very high concern. You know, our diets have changed so much. We're a water and land people, and we have so many health issues today because we're no longer able to maintain our natural diets. That's highly concerning for our future generations, right? So we're going to see increased health issues. We're going to have to see our youth move into other communities because they can no longer stay in our traditional communities. So they're forced out. So they lose their culture, right? They lose that sense of place. Ultimately they lose their identity, right? And I think that loss of identity, that loss of who we are, that's the nightmare. That's what really keeps me up at night. That's what keeps pushing me forward, to try to do everything that I possibly can with my tribal people to save the youth.
Yeah. Dr. Mustafa, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the loss of identity in your work with the National Wildlife Federation, and the importance of inclusion in the environmental space.
Yeah, it shows which cultures, which people that we honor. In many instances, by the reflections of those who sit on the boards, who sit in the senior management, in the middle management, and the lack thereof. And when you don't do that, when you don't diversify, those positions, then you send a very clear message to folks that this is not a place that you're welcomed. It's almost like in some of our natural spaces where there are people of color who can't go in certain locations because they know they are unwelcomed. So when it comes to conservation organizations, environmental organizations, they have a distinct responsibility to actually evolve and grow. And if they don't, then they're operating from a 20th century paradigm, which is very antiquated. Their membership bases will shrink. The resources that they will receive will shrink, because there is a cultural change that is happening not only across our country, but across the planet, where folks are demanding that you honor the voices, the innovation, the ingenuity that people of color bring to the process. And if you refuse to do that, then what you are saying is that your organization is not prepared to be effective in the 21st century. And there will be new organizations that will come into being that will fill that space. So either you get it together or get out of the way.
And just in terms of that evolution, Chief, I'm wondering, we spoke a little bit earlier with Nate about the inherent codependence and reliance that we have on our federal and state governments and tribal institutions that, we're invested in these institutions, but the relationship can be nuanced, right? I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit to that, just, you know, in tandem with Dr. Mustafa's points around inclusion and representation when it comes to facing and addressing the climate changes of today.
Okay, so just as an example, we have what's called state recognition, right? We are recognized as a tribe by the state of Louisiana. That doesn't get you a whole lot. All right, so we do now have a seat at some tables, but that's based on the organization itself. You know, like we've begun working with the USDA and RCS, okay, but that's an independent thing. Now, we are pursuing federal acknowledgement. And for those that don't understand what federal acknowledgement is, a tribe is made to prove that they meet 7 mandatory criteria, right? And if you meet the 7 mandatory criteria, you're granted federal acknowledgement. And they basically say, yes, tribe. We have for forever. Okay. And what that will do is it will give us the opportunity to have a say. It will also give us the opportunity to qualify for resources through the federal government for things like housing and education and health care. Right? But again, the mandatory criteria in order to be acknowledged as a tribe. And not only do you have to fight to get acknowledgement, you have to fight to keep it. Because they can strip you of it at any moment if you no longer meet that criteria. And in that, we don't agree with the criteria because not only are they saying, okay, we have to make you prove all of this stuff, and we're just going to tell you how to be a tribe. Right? So you're forced into having tribal councils. You're forced into having a percentage of people reside within your traditional community. If you percentage, they can strip your federal acknowledgement and you no longer have a voice. And that's frightening, right?
Yeah.
And we have over 560 something federally acknowledged tribes, and those tribes are I mean, they are reviewed constantly. Everything that they do is monitored. In truth, if you want to see if the federal acknowledgement process is beneficial to tribes, take a look at what's happening in the Dakotas. Who wants to believe that federal acknowledgement is beneficial acknowledgement and have had it for a very long time?
That's helpful. I want to just also read, because there are some connectivity issues, but you're lifting up a really important infrastructure need to be able to not even create equal footing, but just do, quite frankly, for our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And something that you've shared with us is, and I'm quoting you now, we've always been here since before the Civil War. My people had community gardens along the water where everyone could plant what they needed while making sure their neighbors didn't go hungry. But the federal government does not recognize my tribe. They say there is no money to protect us, and they will not do what is needed for our people. You've gone on to sort of articulate some of that, the process for that. But one other piece here that I want to share with the group is the crisis has forced my tribe and others in Louisiana and Alaska to take the unprecedented step of filing a formal complaint with the United Nations, accusing the federal government of committing serious human rights violations by failing to protect us from the devastating impacts of the climate change experience that we are having, while also ignoring the damage that oil and gas companies are doing to our land. So, you know, it's clear as day, and it's important that our audience is aware that there are hooks legally, but you have now had to take the unprecedented step of going to the United Nations to manage a domestic resource issue that is squarely rooted in equity. And, you know, Dr. Mustafa also spoke earlier about these antiquated sort of energy systems and pipelines that we're relying on from yesteryear to continue to fuel the nation moving forward. as we effectively operate as a Superfund site as money, as oil moves across to other countries. So I think it's really important to make sure that people understand that you are leveraging what you all have in terms of recourse, and that's still not enough. And so I just want to give you a moment, and then we will move to our audience, but I just want to give you a moment to articulate whether or not you have any hopes of success with advancing things to the United Nations.
We are hopeful, right? You have to keep hope. I mean, if you lose your hope, then what else is there, right? Then you lose your will to fight. And we can never do that, right? We know that there's a better way. And when we know that there's a better way, we need to do that. And I'm going to be honest, under the current administration, we know how that relationship has been, but we do have hope, and we're going to keep pursuing it regardless. You cannot stop fighting for what is right. So let's say we don't get an answer back. That's not going to stop us. We're going to keep taking every route possible to make a difference, because we're only here for a season and the future generations are counting on us, and that's important.
I appreciate that. We're going to pull in our audience questions. I think we have a question on confronting denialism. So what can we say to those who seem to be in the camp of, there is no climate change, it's a hoax? Anyone can take this on.
Well, go ahead, Nate.
Oh, okay. I'll just be quick. I think it's fascinating because it is something that we've seen firsthand quite a bit. And I think one of the key ways that we can share the importance of what's going on right now is, I think, to relate it to what's happening in some of these communities that are impacted, and make sure there's a real understanding and education around how these things are linked together. Sometimes it takes something big or something dramatic to shift ideas. When we were in the panhandle of Florida, Hurricane Michael had ended up being classified as a Category 5 hurricane in 2018. This community in the Florida Panhandle, specifically in Panama City, we heard from many people who said, I don't know what's going on right now in our climate or why it's happening, but clearly something is going on, right? To go from a tropical storm, 48 hours later, a Category 5 hurricane that devastates a community, that kills many people, something is happening. And so I think this framing of connecting it to, obviously not everybody is going to have that experience of going through a hurricane, but I do think you have to frame it in a way that communities can understand and say, look, at the very least, let's start from the baseline that things are different now than they were before. Then we can start to address the reasons why and look at the science and understand and have those, those conversations. But if we can find a common ground around the fact that what we're seeing happening today, the floods, the droughts, the wildfires in California, the hurricanes in the Caribbean, in the Atlantic, if we can at least come together and agree that what's happening now is different than what was happening 20 years ago, 50 years ago, then at least that's a starting point for a conversation. And I think that's where we have to begin.
That's helpful. Mustafa, did you want to contribute?
Sure. So I've been blessed to work in close to 1,000 communities now across our country and outside of our country, and 2 years on Capitol Hill, where I got a chance to meet folks on both sides of the aisle and hear how people really think about issues. And when the cameras aren't there, those who sometimes play the role of climate deniers, they'll tell you, yeah, I know it's real, but I got to deal with my constituency, and there's a huge amount of money that's being pumped in to get me to, say certain things, to act a certain way, to vote a certain way. So we need to understand the power that exists inside of our vote to make sure that there are people there who actually, understand and honor science, and also that are willing to stand up and do the right thing. But here's where folks have made a mistake in the past. We've made a mistake because we want to have a climate conversation in a way that scientists share information. And that is not what everyday folks are looking for. There will be some folks who want to go deep on the issues, and that's fine when people are at that. My formula over the years has been, if Mrs. Ramirez and Mr. Johnson doesn't get it, then you're doing something wrong. So therefore, when I talk about the impacts that are happening from the climate crisis, I start with things that are going on in everyday people's lives. So when I talk about air pollution, I tell people and I share with people that more people are dying from that than are dying from gun violence, that are dying from car crashes. And those are things that everybody has experienced. And then I take it from there and say that same pollution that is killing folks that you see each and every day is also warming up our oceans and warming up our planet and causing these storms to become stronger, and all these other types of dynamics that are going on. You remember when Mrs. Jenkins had that stroke because the temperature was 100 degrees for a number of days, and people will begin to nod their head. Yeah, well, there's a direct connection between what's going on in this space, and let's unpack that. So we need to meet people where they are. We need to make sure that the language is one that resonates with them because it comes out of their own sets of experiences. And then, of course, because I spent time at the Hip Hop Caucus, I'm also going to say we need to be better utilizing and authentically partnering with the artists and entertainers who can touch people's souls and can touch their minds and can help to motivate folks. So it's going to take all of us to actually win on this issue, but we just have to remember that we have power and that we can actually make change and we can win on the climate crisis.
And I think that that's a perfect dovetail into, I know we have a question on environmental racism, and I want to make sure we pull our audience members in, but I think that that gets right to the core of being able to communicate to different demographics. So can we see that question? How has systemic racism influenced the impact of climate change? Just go on and answer the question. I think we know what's being asked here. Thank you for the brownie and Stony. I think let's use our time to just get right at it. Chief Sherelle, do you have anything that you want to include here?
Okay, so basically, how has it influenced the impact of climate change? So our people have been here for many generations, and regardless of all the attempts at genocide, we're still here. So that's got to speak for something. Basically, what we've had to deal with personally, right? Try to speak towards leaders and people are in power, right? That are supposed to be in control of creating positive change. Being Indigenous, and for example, my mom is one of the last people to go to one of the Native American schools here in our area. She's only 59 years old. They look at us like we just don't know any better, right? So they just push aside our traditional knowledge, and they say, well, they're not educated, right? They don't have a college degree. They don't have, all of these different things that all of our non people of color brothers and sisters, that they had the advantage to go and get. They have the college degrees and all of these different things, and they have access to better field of work, than we do. So all of our traditional knowledge bypassed, and it's a sad way of working with leaders when they can just push aside what it is that you have to say as you being not educated.
And your point, when you're thinking about this specific demographic, Black, Indigenous, people of color, it really is helpful to talk about dismantling. And so, Carol, one of the reasons we started with you with this question is because I think you're taking those steps, right? Like your initial outreach to be recognized at the federal level. You're doing outreach when you're not being heard, to go to the United Nations. I mean, you're looking at constructs and trying to figure out how to dismantle it. I want to turn to Nate because I feel like you all are doing the same thing. You're bringing a vital resource, food, in the moment of need, but you're also sensitive to the interloper dynamic, right? You can't just parachute in and not empower the people and the local bakers who there have the infrastructure, but just need support in that moment. So what are some of the recommendations from where you sit that can be used to dismantle some of the environmental racism that we're experiencing?
Yeah, I think that, step one, of course, as you mentioned, is we need to acknowledge that it's there, right? And as Dr. Mustafa mentioned, that the systems that have been set up over the decades have enabled us to end up where we are today. And so I think when you start with that framing, it makes it easier to say, okay, now let's look to kind of address what the outcome of that has been and how do we start to chip away. Yeah. I definitely agree with the chief with Chief Sherrill that we oftentimes underestimate the capabilities of our communities, right? We put a lot of blame into their situation and their circumstances while ignoring all of the outside impacts that really have caused that situation. And I think that's a really good place to start, is looking at the existing knowledge, the existing experience, the wisdom, I think the desire for individuals, for communities to transform themselves, and look at those places that are most impacted right now, and pull out some of the amazing ideas and help lift them and get them off the ground, right? That it's not about coming in always with a solution from the outside, but about identifying the smart ways to empower what already might be there and improve upon it. And we've seen the disastrous effects of what happens when you try to come in and fix a problem without really acknowledging what's already there on the ground. In Haiti, there's been huge challenges around access to food. And one of the solutions that I think folks thought was a good idea was, let's get a lot of rice onto the island, into the country, into Haiti. Make sure we're distributing rice. USAID has dumped millions of tons of rice from the United States. And because it's coming from USAID, it's coming from our federal government, it means they have to purchase from local US farmers. This is starting to shift a little bit. The World Food Program and others can start to purchase more locally. So what ends up happening is we dump all of this free rice onto Haiti with this sort of good intention of keeping people fed. Well, what happens then is you've completely undermined the local Haitian rice farmers, because now they can't sell their rice anymore, and you devastate an entire industry in the process of trying to help people, get through, a climate related issue of maybe they're not able to grow, because of drought or other reasons. And now what ends up happening is now there's no more industry left. Now there's no more Haitian rice left. And now they're dependent on the outside, which again leads to all of these problems when you start to face climate disasters coming into the fray, because then when that supply chain gets cut off, or when that dependence gets cut off, people simply starve. So I think if we step back and we say, look at what's already happening, look at the knowledge, look at the come with a sense of respect instead of a sense of pity, right? You start there and you come in with that level of respect, and then you help uplift. And I think that's how you can start to address some of these issues.
It's a really helpful frame, because the reality is there are constructs that obviously have led folks to different points, and either they are acknowledged and that the historical context is there, or you're right, you feel like any handout is is helping the cause, when in fact it may be incredibly disruptive, and maybe more of a drag on the system sort of longer term. I think as I listen to your response, Nate, I want to just sort of pull us together, because we're sort of gathered here today as a result of the DNC. And there's a lot happening politically in the world. And one of the things I was thinking about, oddly enough, as you were sharing, was the reaction to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden during the debate around public busing. And it's so interesting, because I had such a different reaction to that moment, where she was, I think, just speaking to American history in terms of the busing system, right? And to me, it was just an example of the resilience of, within one generation, being able to go from that public busing construct to now being a nominated presidential candidate. And the resilience, Chief Sherrill, of your people despite it all, right? And the resilience, Nate, when you guys have to strap up, boots on the ground, and be able to support people when they just need to be fed, right? The work that you've done across 1,000 communities, Dr. Mustafa. I think what I want to make sure our audience is left with today is the frame of the social constructs that have led people to being without for a moment, right? But people being completely capable of supporting themselves with the right level of support. And so to that, I want to shift to a question that we have around how do you get involved, right? For the folks who any of your messages today have resonated with, if you're new to environmental justice work, where's a good place to start to facilitate sustained involvement? Who wants to take that on?
I mean, it's really pretty simple. There are a number of environmental justice organizations and frontline organizations across our country. So you should reach out, but make sure that you're coming as an authentic partner or an authentic ally, so that, there can be real, true building together. Everybody is blessed with different skills and abilities, and many organizations can use that as long as it's focused properly in alignment with the priorities that they have to make real change happen. Mm-hmm. So, it's not that difficult to find the organizations, but then of course you have to find the one that fits right with you, because, there are different focuses that are there. So people appreciate when you come and you listen, and then after you listen, then sort of take that in, and then figure out, how you can be a blessing to the movement, to the organizations.
Thank you for that. Nate?
Yeah, my recommendation would be to, really start in your own backyard. Whether you live in a city or a small town or a rural part of America, I think looking at what types of issues your local community is facing, and start there. And I assure you, there will be some, even if you don't think that environmental justice issues or climate change has touched your community yet. It probably has. And start to dig a little bit and understand and look at what may be going on. Where are there food deserts or lack of access to fresh food that, because of some of these longstanding issues that we've discussed? Are there community gardens to get involved in? Are there issues around industry and pollution, that you may not have any idea about? Is somebody trying to put a trash incinerator into a community in South Baltimore, and maybe you don't even know that there's a movement to stop it, right? And so I think looking at what's happening in your own backyard is a real way to get involved and get out there and look at ways that you can maybe start to play a little bit of a role that go beyond just your own your own day-to-day. Yeah. I think a lot of issues around climate change initially, or a lot of ways to get involved, the conversation tended to be around how you yourself could have a lower carbon footprint and change your light bulbs and things like that. And sure, I'm not saying that we should not do all of those things, but I do think we have to look at this issue as one of inequity, and one of how the what is playing out is impacting others more than it is impacting, maybe impacting yourself, and using that position of privilege and power to start to give back and look at ways, look at the local legislation that might be going on in your communities. We talk a lot about the federal government. We're here, at the DNC talking about a very important election coming up. But the most important elections often happen right there in your district, in your city. Those are where the local regulations are being decided upon. Those issues are critical. And so don't forget to look locally. So that's my recommendation.
No, it's a great point. And you two are being far too modest. I also just want to call out Dr. Mustafa's organization with the National Wildlife Federation. You can support them. Nate's organization with the World Central Kitchen. You can support them. And Chief Sherrill, I just wanted to give you an opportunity as well, of course, to identify what you think folks can do to support.
Oh, thank you. And look, I'm going to agree wholeheartedly with Dr. Mustafa and Mr. Nate. They are so right. And one of the first things I let everybody know is I am not a public speaker at all. All right. I am just your average everyday person, right, that pays attention to what's happening in my community. And I happen to be a chief, so I represent a people. But guess what? We're all brothers and sisters. We should be speaking out for each other. Those elected officials we have, that's what they're there for. They are supposed to be representing the people. So if you see that there is something wrong in your community, raise your voice. Look for others that are willing to raise their voice along with you. Call your elected officials. Let them know what's going on. Let them know what they need to know. Because a lot of times, in truth, some of them mean well, but they're very busy people. They're handling many different issues. And if you don't raise your voice, they're not going to know. And I'm the type of person that I'm going to keep raising my voice. I'm going to call you. I'm going to tell you what's going on. Like we recently had an issue with a shrimp purchase, and I was really quick to call Garrett Grace's office, Congressman Grace's office, and be like, what did you do? You didn't do this properly. You only went half the way. You didn't speak to the traditional community harvesters, right? And now we have another opportunity that came up with another shrimp purchase, and we're hoping that's some of the fruit of our labor right there, and they're going to try to do this all the way this time, right? Wow. But it's so right. Raise your voice. Be heard.
Raise your voice. You all have offered tremendous perspectives today. I want to thank our panelists for joining us at the Rabin Respite. I think that your words are just so timely and important as we think about the next election and the importance of these issues, the importance and the implications of the people on the ground that they impact day to day, from food to climate to health, all of it. I want to thank our audience for being so engaged and for joining us. I want to just remind you all that, in addition to being live on Facebook and on YouTube at the Rabin Group, we will be keeping this live on our YouTube page. And this is part of a series. So please continue to stay with us with the Rabin Respite tomorrow and Thursday at rabinrespite.com. Your time and attention to these issues really helps us do the work we do every single day. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that Green 2.0 is another entity that people can look to if they're really looking to get involved and better assess and understand organizations that do tremendous work in the environmental space. So thank you all for your time today. I would ask personally that you stay in the fight. You continue to raise your voices. The time is now to get involved, and we're so grateful to have had your time and talents and contributions today. Thank you.